Welcome everyone to our very last National Park Service Presents of the season. Woo! I know you're clapping with me at home. This is an online series that runs every other Tuesday at 6 p.m. We started it in January, and today is the very last one. And if you're like, oh my gosh, Karen, how is this the last one? I want to see them all. You are in luck because we have recorded every single one of them this season. And they are all on a YouTube playlist on our Boston Public Library YouTube page. Honestly, the best way to find it is just Google Boston Public Library YouTube, and you will see it then and there. I believe it's like the first one on the list that pops up. Okay, so if you also are someone who do not enjoy the captions, or even you just don't want them on because everything is fully enabled, you can hide them yourself. You click on the very bottom under CC, and you can hit hide subtitles. So that way you don't have them on. If you like them, I enjoy them, I keep mine on. And for all of you asking burning questions, you're like, oh, here's my chance. You are welcome to type in and ask your questions. The very bottom, there's a little bubble, the little chat bubble. Notice the to form. When you click on the bubble, it will say, hey, who do you want to send this to? Do you want to send it to hosts and panelists? And a host and panelist is everyone you can see on screen. So me, our beautiful speakers, our wonderful moderators, those are the ones that will get your question. If you want to send it to everyone, which you are welcome to do, make sure you say you're sending it to everyone. And that gets sent to the people on screen and every single person back at home. Our one rule is just be respectful, which we know you will because people are great. All right, so once again, don't be shy, just be respectful. We do have amazing moderators that are moderating the chat, and your questions will get pulled in at the end and asked at the end. All right, so here's a little info about our two amazing speakers we got going on here. The first one is Mr. Dennis Lloyd. He was born in Roxbury, Massachusetts, attended undergrad Boston State College and master's degree from Howard University School of Architecture and Planning. A Vietnam veteran, served with the 52nd Combat Aviation Battalion in Pleiku, Vietnam during the Tet Offense. Awarded the Army Aircraft Crewman's Wings for flying over 100 combat hours as an aerial assault door gunner. I'm just very impressed. Not only has done that, he's also worked for the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the Boston Globe newspaper as the arts and entertainment manager for over 20 years. I get my digital subscription every day. And property developer and owner in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He lives part of the year in Atlanta, Georgia. Yes, nice and warm, much better than up here when it's chilly. And currently serves as church vestry of St. Paul's Episcopal in Atlanta, Georgia. He also served over 20 years on the steward board of the historic Charles Street African Methodist Episcopal Church in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He's married to the wonderful Beverly Parks Lloyd. Together, they have 5 children and 5 grandchildren. And last but never least, we have Egypt Lloyd. Egypt is the founder of Takeoff Drones, a drone servicing company. Egypt is a commercial pilot certified by the Federal Aviation Administration, also known as the FAA. Egypt has over 5 years of experience flying drones and has logged over 5,000 drone flight hours. Prior to Takeoff Drones, Egypt was an accomplished senior government underwriter for over 20 years, with over 20 years of experience in the real estate industry. It's very impressive. Egypt is also the creator and founder of the Neat and Orderly Tots Enrichment Program that was implemented in schools throughout the states of Georgia and Colorado. Egypt Lloyd is currently seeking a degree from Embry-Riddle College of Aeronautics and Aviation and Aerospace. That is a tongue twister, but oh my goodness, I'm so impressed. Okay, and not only are we now seeing these amazing speakers, but you'll also be joined in the chat box by Emily Levine of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. In the 18th century, Dennis and Egypt Lloyd's ancestors were enslaved and seized their freedom on the estate that later became the Longfellow House. The National Park Service is honored to partner with the Lloyds, their Slave Legacy History Coalition, and other members of the descendant community to support the ongoing research and interpretation of this important history. So without any more talking from me, I promise I am done. Let us welcome Egypt and Dennis Lloyd as they present Descendants of Darby Vassall. Woo!
Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No mourning, no mourning, no mourning over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. They'll be singing over me. They'll be singing over me. They'll be singing over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. The lyrics was composed by S. Coleridge Taylor during the civil rights movements of the 1960s. What this reflects is a deep connection and feeling that the African Americans have had to their enslavement.
Good evening. My name is Dennis Lloyd. I'm here tonight along with one of my daughters, Egypt Lloyd, and we are pleased to present a brief chronology of our family history and slavery. We are descendants of Tony and Cuba Vassall, slaves once owned by Henry Vassall and Penelope Royall. Penelope Royall's family endowed a Harvard professorship in law in 1781 that would eventually become Harvard Law School. So tonight, what we'd like to do is take you down the history road our ancestors traveled. There's no question any discussion concerning slavery or the uncovering of slavery can be complex, confusing, and controversial. Our discussion tonight concerning our ancestral grandparents, Tony and Cuba Vassall, and their children, Darby, Cyrus, and is no exception. So let's start with Isaac Royall Sr. In 1737, Antiguan sugar plantation and slave owner Isaac Royall Sr., in the wake of a slave revolt, moved his family from Antigua to colonial Medford, Massachusetts, bringing with him a number of enslaved people. 2 years later, in 1739, after arriving in Massachusetts, Isaac Royall Sr. passed away, leaving the bulk of his estate to his namesake, Isaac Royall Jr. Penelope Royall. In his will, Isaac Royall Sr. also bequeaths to his daughter, Penelope, one Negro woman called Abba, her 6 children, including one child named Cuba, who would become our ancestral grandmother. Henry Vassall. In 1741, Henry Vassall, following in his father Leonard Vassall, a Jamaican sugar plantation and slave owner, travels to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Henry Vassall brings with him to Cambridge, Massachusetts, an enslaved coachman named Anthony or Tony. Henry Vassall and Penelope Royall. In 1742, shortly after arriving in Cambridge, Henry Vassall marries Penelope Royall and they move into his home on Brattle Street. Upon their marriage, Henry and Penelope take Cuba, her mother Abba, and 4 of her siblings with them to their Brattle Street home. Tony and Cuba. In 1742, the same year, Henry and Penelope married. Their slaves, Tony and Cuba, meet each other and also marry. The union between Tony and Cuba Vassall produced 6 children, which included Darby Vassall, Cyrus, and Catherine Vassall. Now, I'd like to stop for just a quick minute to bring up 3 important points that should be noted. Clearly, as a family from a historical standpoint, we are humbled to be able to be exposed to the slave legacy and history knowledge of our family's arrival and enslavement in America. Point number 2, Northern and Southern slavery. There is no question slavery is slavery. However, it is important to point out there is a difference between being enslaved in the South on a cotton plantations of Mississippi and Alabama, and being enslaved in a house on Brattle Street in Cambridge. And point number 3, a culture stolen. Despite being enslaved in the North or South, slaves' culture, history, and families were stolen by them by slavery. Introduction of slavery into America. In 1619, since the introduction of slavery into the United States, abolitionists, historians, Black activists, civil rights leaders, politicians, and many others have spoken out about the past, present, and future impact of the sinister, inhumane, destructive effects of slavery has had on generations of African Americans. El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. As a young man growing up in Roxbury, Massachusetts, one of the most profound quotes I remember hearing as a young man, which has a lasting impact on me, concerning the damage slavery created, was made by El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X. The quote, "X is not my real name, but if you study history, you'll find out why no African American in Western Hemisphere knows his real name. Some of his ancestors kidnapped our ancestors from Africa and took us into the Western Hemisphere and sold us into slavery. Our names were stripped, our families separated from us, our culture and language taken. And so today, we really don't know who we really are. I'm one of those who admit it, and so I just pick X up there to keep from wearing my slave owner's name." Again, this is a quote from El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X. The point that Malcolm X alludes to in his observation: when African Americans were enslaved and brought to America, they were not only stripped of their identity and separated from their families, but also separated from their culture. As a result, the African American culture, when compared to other ethnic cultures in America, is a new culture. A new culture. When other ethnic groups arrived in America, despite the circumstances, whether from England, Ireland, Italy, wherever, in most cases, they came from their native country with the ability to maintain their names, their culture, and language. This is unlike enslaved African Americans who, upon their arrival in America, were stripped of their names, separated from their families, their culture, and their languages. African American culture. Enslaved African Americans were captured and brought to America from multiple countries: Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, and other Central Western African countries. Each of these countries had their own culture and traditions. 300 years of bondage. For over 300 years, while held in bondage, the only commonalities enslaved Africans had: they were stolen from their home in Africa and their respective countries and enslaved in America. They had a common desire to survive, and their skin color was Black. Consequently, for over 300 years of enslavement, a new culture evolved and identified in America, not as the culture of their native country, but as Black culture. Why is this important? Dick Gregory, civil rights activist, among other things, is quoted as saying, "A man without knowledge of himself and his heritage is like a tree without roots." Spanish-born American philosopher George Santayana put it another way. He is quoted as saying, "To know your future, you must know your past." Understanding our family history. In 1737, our family's understanding of our past began when Antiguan sugar planter, slave owner, Isaac Royall Sr. brought our enslaved ancestor, Abba, and her 6 children, including Cuba, to Medford, Massachusetts. In 1742, Henry Vassall brought his enslaved postman, Tony Vassall, to Cambridge. The Harvard connection. and this is important here. In the summer of 2019, a young Harvard undergraduate, Carissa Chin, contacted my daughter, Jordan Lloyd, and inquired if she was related to Muriel Florence Lloyd and Herbert Wolff Sr. This particular interaction propelled us into following up in the conversation with Carissa, and as we provided information that connected our genealogical past with the information that Carissa had, and also to the Vassall and Royal families at Harvard University. Carissa Chin connects the Lloyd family to Harvard University Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, commissioned by Lawrence Bacow and chaired by Tamika Brown Nagin. Now, again, this is a very important bit of information because as most of you may know, today, Harvard University released its report on slavery. And again, it was commissioned by President Bacow and chaired by Dean Tamika Brown Nagin. Continuing the Vassall-Lloyd family research. First steps, what did we do? Utilizing our family documents and family historical knowledge, utilizing Carissa Chin's research, and exploring the archival information from Harvard University, the Longfellow House Museum of African American History, the Royal House, Christ Church, History of Cambridge, and Cambridge Black History Project, and other institutions. We were able to uncover a vast amount of information on our family history. In 1769, Darby Vassall, one of Tony and Cuba Vassall's 6 children, was born. In 1796, Darby and his brother Cyrus were founding members of the African Society, a mutual aid organization for free Black citizens in Massachusetts. And in 1835, Darby and Cyrus Vassall founded the Able School for African American Children on Beacon Hill, present-day site of the Museum of African American History located on Joy Street. Now, if you have not had an opportunity to visit the Museum of African American History, I like to suggest that you do. It has a wonderful staff, and they have a vast amount of history encompassed within the walls of the museum. And under the great leadership of Leon Wilson, Lamerchi, Frazier, you cannot go wrong, and you will have a very enlightening and very informative visit to the Museum of African American History. Darby Vassall's son-in-law. In 1836, Darby Vassall's son-in-law, Jonas W. Clark, is a signer on a petition to incorporate the Infant School Associations for Colored Youth of Boston in support of the newly founded Abel Smith School on Beacon Hill. Jonas W. Clark later spearheaded a petition to the legislature calling for equal school rights that decried discrimination solely on account of one's complexion. Jonas W. Clark was also an early founder of the Prince Hall Free and Accepted Masons in Massachusetts, and they're headquartered in Grove Hall at Roxbury, of which I am a member of Prince Hall Free and Accepted Masons. In 1851, between 1851 and 1858, Jonas W. Clark and others repeatedly petitioned the state legislature to incorporate a militia, the Massasoit Guard, which was intended to be a colored militia company. Now, can you grab that? You know, given all the militias that are across this country, and given the state of political tensions across the country, in 1851, here in Massachusetts, Jonas W. Clark, a descendant of our family, petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to form a colored militia. Could we do that today? That's a question, that should be asked. I doubt it, and I'm not even sure there are any militias in Massachusetts. And finally, Jonas W. Clark is buried in the Masonic Cemetery a few miles from Harvard Square on Gardner Street in Arlington, Massachusetts. Now, I will say that as a member of the Prince Hall Free and Accepted Masons, for a number of years, I was served as the chairperson over the Prince Hall Grand Lodge Cemetery Association, which oversees the maintenance of cemetery in Arlington. And annually on Memorial Day, we hold a ceremony commemorating those individuals who are buried in this particular cemetery site, which was bequeathed to the Masons in the early 1800s by a white farmer who lived in Arlington, and he bequeathed this land to the Masons for the explicit purpose of having colored, Black, Masons being buried in this particular site. Darby Vassall dies. In October 1861, Darby Vassall dies and is buried at his own request in Henry and Penelope Vassall's family tomb, which is located in Christ Church in Harvard Square. We had the opportunity to visit the site, and the church, as you know, Christ Church is located right in Harvard Square, and in the undercroft, there is a space and there is a tomb. And if I recall, there is, in addition to Henry and Penelope Vassall, there are also several other family members buried there, in addition to Darby Vassall. From a secondary source indicates that Tony and Cuba Vassall, the parents of Darby Vassall, may also be buried there, but we have not been able to substantiate that. And in 1861, Darby Vassall's obituary is featured in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Obituary of Jonas Clark's granddaughter, Frances L. Jackson. Now, this paper, The Guardian, was a paper that was founded by William Monroe Trotter, an abolitionist and activist in the Boston community. And he founded The Guardian, and which was, I guess, the sounding board during that time for Black news within the community. And coincidentally, in our January meeting of the Slave Legacy History Coalition meeting, we had Dr. Kerry Greenwich from Tufts University, who spoke on this very subject, William Monroe Trotter and the impact The Guardian has had during that time, and what it meant to the African-American community in Boston. Now, the significance of this particular edition is that included in here is the obituary of our, great-grandmother, Frances L. Jackson. And in here, if you can see it, it says that Frances L. Jackson, nee Weedman, on Thursday, February 28th, Boston, has lost another one of its highly respected residents. She was the eldest daughter of the late James A. and Frances J. Weedman of Chelsea, granddaughter of Jonas Clark, one of the founders of Prince Hall Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons. And it goes on to read, but the significant point here is that she leaves to mourn for their loss two daughters, Mrs. Maud E. Bennett of Melrose and Mrs. Rosetta A. Wolff of Roxbury. Now, Rosetta A. Wolff is my grandmother, okay, and my daughter's great grandmother, and she's buried in actually in Everett, Malden area, and she also leaves a host of other relatives. But It goes on to say, which is cut off, that Francis L. Jackson was buried at St. Augustine's and St. Martin's Church, which was located at 29 Lenox Street in Roxbury. And that is our family church in Roxbury, and where members of my family still attend. Francis L. Jackson's children, as I mentioned, Rosetta Asing Wolff, Oscar Jackson, and Maud L. Bennett. And again, just to note that Francis L. Jackson is the granddaughter of Jonas Clark, and Jonas W. Clark is the son-in-law of Darby Vassall. So we can then begin to see how that family tree, dating back to Harvard, to the Vassalls, and to has evolved. And so again, a very important point. A marriage certificate, okay. This is a marriage certificate of my grandmother, Rosetta Asing, to Herbert Leroy Wolff Sr. And you can see they were married in 1908 at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Boston, Massachusetts. And as we move forward through here, we have some pictures and other information that relates to our family's history. But can you just continue the section? Here is a picture of my grandmother, Rosetta Asing Wolff, and my grandfather, Herbert L. Wolff Sr. This is a picture taken in 1932 of my mother, Muriel Florence Wolff-Lloyd. Again, she's my mother, my grandmother of Jordan, Tanya in Egypt, and great-grandmother of Noel, my grandchildren, Noel, Lloyd, Manuel, and Leah Lloyd Thomas. Picture of my Aunt Hazel, May Wolff, and her brother, Herbert L. Wolff Jr. My Aunt Hazel, my mother, and my grandfather, we all lived together. My father took sick early on, so I grew up with the three of them, and we resided most of my life on Hollander Street in Roxbury. This is a family picture. I'm not sure of the date, but it's taken at 2029 Lenox Street in Roxbury, Massachusetts. This is my grandfather on the end, Herbert L. Wolff. He was the leader of the family, and along with his sister, cousins, my mother, uncle, and some of his children in the background. So this is a very treasured picture because it demonstrates at a time when there were a large number of Wolffs and Lloyds who attended St. Augustine and St. Martin's Church in Roxbury. And by the way, St. Augustine's and St. Martin's Church was under, at that time, the, I shouldn't say jurisdiction, but association with the Society of St. John's the Evangelist. The Society of St. John's the Evangelist, SSJE, has a monastery on Memorial Drive, right at the intersection, I believe it's John F. Kennedy Drive and Memorial Drive. And for years up until the 1970s, maybe early 80s, the priests that oversaw the church, they were in fact members of Society of St. John's the Evangelist. This is a picture of my aunt, my great aunt, and Blanche Pierce, and she was sister of Francis Jackson. This was taken on Nantucket Island in front of 17 York Street, where she owned. And again, this was in the 1940s. I recall when my Aunt Blanche passed away. She passed away on Humboldt Avenue, and it was on a Sunday morning. And we were by the house, and I remember her passing and everybody crying, of course. But significant to this picture is that she resided on Nantucket Island. And as I understand, I have not been there, but you should go there if you're on Nantucket Island, that the Museum of African American History has a site, museum site on York Street. And as I learned from the President and Executive Director, Leon Wilson, that during that time period, a majority of African Americans that lived on Nantucket lived on the York Street, York Street area. So, and certainly there are still a few African American families that live there. Unfortunately, when my aunt passed away, the transition from one generation to another wasn't as strong as it could be, and the house was lost. This is a picture of my grandfather, Herbert Wolff Sr., who was a businessman and a florist, and he had a business on Main Street in Charlestown, Massachusetts. Now, if everyone and anyone who's familiar with Charleston knows it's been gentrified, and it's always, so it's not what it was. But he did have a business there, and he was a businessman, which carried him in the family for many years. And here's a picture of my grandfather, Herbert Leroy Wolff Sr. This was taken in 1958. He passed away January 12th, 1959. And he passed away on 25 Hollander Street in Roxbury, which is where we live. I was in the next room, and I was a young man, but his children were in his room. And when he, passed away, and, of course, that was a traumatic time period because he was such a critical force in, our family. But he married the granddaughter and descendant of Cuba and Tony Vassall, Rosetta Asing. And here's a picture of my mother and father. My mother and father, Joseph Ivy Lloyd, Muriel Florence Wolff, married him on February 20th in 1938 in Boston, Massachusetts. And the treasured picture. The next generation. This picture is taken at the grave site of my mother and my Aunt Hazel. And pictured in the picture to the left is my granddaughter Leah, my granddaughter Noel, my two of my three daughters, Jordan up front, and my daughter Egypt, who's here with me now. And that person over there with the gray hair, that's me. And one of my oldest daughter, Tanya, is not in this picture. The slave legacy code. Sorry. Just go back on there. Okay. What is taking place now, and what are we doing? The activism of the Vassall Lloyd family has been continuous for a few hundred years in the Boston community. Whether if you trace it back to my great-great-grandparents, and their involvement with the Abel Smith House, subsequent founding of Museum of African History, and other petitions that were put forth by family members. Of course, that was back in the 1800s. Moving forward into this century, what this next generation is doing. We've established, and I say we, myself and my children, with the support and affiliation of other organizations who are exploring and interested in, or institutions that represent slave legacy or the history of this country. So in the fall of 2021, we formed a slave legacy history coalition, and within Cambridge, Boston, and beyond. And we meet once a month to discuss our activities and to share resources. And we have speakers every month, or something of interest to discuss. As a matter of fact, on May 11th, our next meeting, Christine Hutchison Jones will be the guest speaker. And Christine or Chrissy has been the manager, is the manager of the Harvard report that came out today, Initiative on Slave Legacy. So she has a wealth of knowledge, and she's going to bring with her a video, some updated information on Harvard tour of slave sites. And it will be a very interesting and knowledgeable meeting. So if you're interested in being included on our mailing list, and so you can, so you can receive the newsletter. Our email is down below. It's Slave Legacy History Coalition at yahoo.com. Please feel free this evening to send us your email information, and we will put you on it so that you can begin to participate and understand more of the history of slavery. And now, the importance, again, of this is that over 200 years plus, our family was involved in slave legacy, the impact of it, and trying to move, the African-American community forward and out of the realms and impact of slavery. Here we are, some 200, so odd years later, and family members are still involved with this, this challenge. And as we begin to bring information from the past, married with the present, so that we'll have a better understanding of what can happen in the future or should not happen. The Slave Legacy Coalition, an affiliate organization, for those of you who are interested in joining us, is, there are several of them: the African American Historical and Genealogical Society, Atlanta Black Box, as you can see, Cambridge Black History Project, Cambridge Historical Commission, Cambridge Public Library, Christ Church in Cambridge, of course, the Lloyd family, Vassall family descendants, First Church in Cambridge, Hidden Brookline, History Cambridge, the Initiative on Harvard and the Slave Legacy. They have not actually members, but they have always had someone representing them there. Lauren Goshless, who is a resident of Brattle Street, Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, and who have been very helpful and with us as the Museum of African American History, the Robbins House, and of course the Royal House and Slave headquarters in Medford, along with Dr. Tatiana Cruz. These are some of the organizations that are affiliated with the Slave Legacy History Coalition. And finally, acknowledgements. There are a lot of people over the years and months since we have been involved who have provided us with information. I'd certainly like to take the time to acknowledge them and thank them. The Museum of African American History, the Longfellow House, at the Harvard University. Thank you to Boston Public Library tonight for letting us present at the Cambridge Black History Project, History Cambridge, and of course, Carissa Chin, who in fact introduced us to this whole new level of understanding of our family's history. So we appreciate tonight, and we are open to take questions, and we thank all of you who in fact have listened to tonight, but it's not over. Ask a question and we can, we'll try to respond.
Thank you so much, Dennis, in Egypt, and a lot of really lovely appreciation in the chat as well. So if you have a chance to take a look at that. We have a few questions, and then questions from folks in the audience have been coming in. So keep those coming, and we will take a look at those as we go. You walked us through a little bit of your family's process, researching and learning about this early family history. And I'm wondering if you'd like to tell us a little bit about what you still hope to be able to learn as this research continues.
Well, both of us can certainly participate. But what we hope to learn, obviously, is more of the detail of our family's involvement at Harvard and in Massachusetts. There's a wealth of information, and we are, overwhelmed, certainly, to try and, decipher it, organize it, and to pull it all together. That's one of the reasons why the Slave Legacy History Coalition was formed, because there are a number of institutions, and there's no shortage of historical institutions in Massachusetts and certainly in Boston, Cambridge community. So what we're striving to do is to bring together all of these institutions so that we can have one location where people, and individuals can understand, like we are trying to do right now, our family's history. Okay, I see can I just have to quote, I see there's a friend of mine who, Gregory Dunham, and Gregory is my, actually oldest childhood friend. And we grew up in Roxbury together. And you talk about this history, I'm sure we could share a history how we grew up in Roxbury. But thank you, Gregory. I just wanted to call it. And
I also would like to say thank you to Marike. I'm currently working on a project with her with History of Cambridge on the Toy Road project. So it's good to see you here tonight. So thank you, Marike, for joining.
Thank you. Yes, and thanks. Loving the community that's in the chat here. Would you talk a little bit about what you've learned from the lives of Tony, Cuba, and Darby Vassall, and what you think others might be able to learn from their stories?
Well, I would say the first thing is perseverance, and secondly, determination and perseverance. There's no question that the life that they endured during that time wasn't, switching channels and watching Netflix or wherever. It was tough times, and people were not receptive, and they were in slavery starting with it. And that's obviously what speaks to itself. But so we've learned perseverance, determination, and the willingness to help other people. Our family, through our grandparents and uncles and what have you, have continuously helped people to try and advance the causes of African Americans in Massachusetts, certainly in Boston, and clearly in Roxbury.
Thank you. And I think we should probably switch over to audience questions, because there's a lot of really great stuff coming in. I'll just ask if you'd like to reflect at all on how you think sort of big picture or long-term, the legacy of slavery in the Boston area should be addressed and memorialized. And you've spoken about some of the efforts of the Slave Legacy History Coalition. This is kind of inspired by a question from Beth in the chat. Do you have any big dreams for what the future might hold with this project and others?
Well, the main important thing for me in my life is to leave a great legacy. I don't want the history to repeat itself, the negative part. I want to lay a great foundation for my children and going forward. I think this is a great foundation that we have to start that. So seeing the Slave Legacy History Coalition come together and grow, that would be key. So we can get the word out to know about how important it is to know about your past, so you know where you're going in your future. So that's definitely important. Should be highlighted.
And I concur with that. Legacy and understanding, the history of what has taken place, and it's still in the minds of young people now, so that they can grow and appreciate, the suffering and the strives that their ancestors, had to endure, so that when we go through, and there clearly are a vast number of young African Americans and older, people that are going through historically Black colleges and universities, and other universities and colleges, and people just work hard every day. Unfortunately, there are still some people who have kind of missed a chapter or two. So, and we hope that through our efforts, that we can reach these individuals and that they will understand the challenges and understand what they need to be doing, to prevent things from happening again.
Thank you. We have some, I think, reflections in the chat on what you're speaking to. Barbara says that she'd long known about the Vassals enslaving, but to know the history of your family gives strength and a much bigger, important understanding. So thank you for sharing that. And Jen has a question. Would you consider creating a curriculum for Massachusetts schools to explore the history of Black abolitionists? And how about genealogy? So Jen's thinking about that next generation as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. The answer to that would be
Yes,
absolutely.
without a shadow of a doubt. Absolutely.
Okay. And this would be, well, American history. This is what we're talking about, is American history.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, and keep keep those questions coming in the chat as well, and reflections for Egypt and Dennis. We have a question from Meryl about some of the family history. Do you know when Darby and Cyrus Vassall were emancipated?
I don't have that.
Yeah, we don't have that. We get
Sure.
And we can get back to you on that.
Yeah.
If you email us, I will email you back with that information. But we do know the date. I do apologize that we don't have that exact date in front of us right now.
No, and I will put an article into the chat as well if folks would like to read more about the history of Tony and Cuba Vassall and their children, both enduring slavery and then seizing their freedom. I believe in 1774 on Brattle Street. You can take a look at that there, and definitely that email address I put in earlier if you'd like to follow up with Dennis of Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So, a lot of very knowledgeable folks in the chat too, which is great. Joyce asks, what suggestions do you have for researching the genealogy of enslaved ancestors? Joyce says the Tracing Your Roots show makes it look too easy.
Well, yeah, I know, and they have a big staff, so when you're doing it on your own, it's a little bit more difficult. I would, National Archive. Now, I would suggest, this is my own observation, but I mean, there's of course Ancestry.com, but I would tend to stay away from that because you don't know who puts the information in there, and you go and you plug it, and you receive it. So the best way to do it is the old way, ground pounding yourself, hard work, reading, following up, contacting some of the institutions that we have here, visiting the Longfellow House, visiting the Royal House, visiting the Museum of African American History, so that you can obtain firsthand and see documentation. Harvard University has certainly a wealth of information. And so, that's what I would suggest. Don't go to ancestry.com. It's not,
it's not always accurate.
Not always. It's not always accurate. That's all I'm saying. Put it that way.
There's so much to dig into in that Harvard report. So
I know.
David is asking for sort of any reflection that you might have on Darby Vassall's decision to be buried in the Henry Vassall tomb under Christ Church.
Well, he loved the Lord. It's good that he wanted to be buried in the church, someplace else in the open field. So that can show his heart and his dedication.
No, you're good. Speak up.
And so I think that's a good decision, and just shows you his heart and where his spirituality is at. He loved the Lord. So that's a good decision.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think that it was, an appropriate decision during that time period. And, I mean, it certainly beats being, if you're buried in the corner of some cemetery, but if you have an opportunity to be buried in a church, that's a wonderful thing.
Thank you. And the Christ Church has been involved with the History Coalition, is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Under Ted Hamlet and the vestry, and certainly the research project.
Yeah, absolutely.
As is the First Church of Cambridge also. So
And if you, and I'm not sure if that site is open for the public.
No, I'm not sure either.
Okay.
Another thoughtful question from Joyce. So this brings some of this history up to very current events. What are your thoughts about state legislatures currently talking about prohibiting school children from learning about this country's legacy of racism and slavery? And is there hope for the future?
Well, yeah,
Yes.
yes, there's definitely hope for the future. I mean, that's one of the challenges that we face. But see, what I think the teaching of slavery should be positioned as American history.
Absolutely.
You can't run from American history. History is history. In American history, now it's been redirected through critical race theory, but I've never seen. I'm not really familiar with critical race theory, but what I do know that there's no theory about slavery. You know, I mean, that's a fact, and American history is a fact. So I don't know who injected it. And, I'm not saying that it was, created in the classroom, but it could have been. And but we do need to just reposition it and let people know that we are teaching American history. Slavery is American history. It's American history as Washington supposedly crossing the Delaware. So.
And let me just add to say too, also too, as an African American home, is very important that we start at home first. Now within the school, we got to teach our kids our history. It's our responsibility, so that needs to start at home.
Good, very good point. That's a very good point.
Yeah, so we're not dependent on the schools, even though they need to come up to the standard, but we're going to start at home.
That's right. Very good point. Very good. Okay.
Kathleen also comments in the chat that she wonders if there was an element of Darby Vassall thumbing his nose, so to speak, at his enslavers. So speculating, but this is a question that comes up, I think, often, and there's some complexity there.
Could
Can
you
you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure, just thinking about the complex motivations behind choosing to be buried in Christ Church there. So some other thoughts there in the chat.
Yeah.
But I think, it's a meaningful place to be buried, as you're pointing
Yeah,
out. And it's a church with a lot of history. So
go with that
one. Yeah, absolutely.
Jen also noted, I've always felt that genealogy is an equalizer when it comes to understanding all of our history. Some power there. We are coming up on 7 o'clock, but we've got just a couple more questions. Dava is asking, are you able to guide people who want to get the history for themselves?
That's a good question, and stay tuned. Become associated with the Slave Legacy Coalition, and I think that's something that we would want to embrace and will embrace as we move down the road.
Absolutely.
And some Frida is concurring in the chat. Awesome point, Egypt, and talking about, as a parent, you are your child's first teacher. So I think a really powerful point. I would just invite both of you, if there are any final reflections that you'd like to share with us before we move towards wrapping up this evening.
Well, it's all very humbling. And we definitely are on the path to making a legacy for our children, my children, and for our other family members. So we won't have to repeat the past. We want to move forward in the right direction. And we're just, taking this all in. But it's very humbling, and it makes you appreciate your family history, and makes you be able to see clear your future and exactly what you want to do, and not waste time and know what you need to put your efforts to.
I agree. Certainly, as Frida pointed out, family is the first step. But also, we want to, continue to participate, as individuals, but we also want to engage with other individuals who have a positive, direction and who are interested in studying the history of slave legacy. It's so fascinating, so important, because again, you know, we won't get lost as we move down the highway in the future if we understand what is taking place. So we welcome all opportunities to interact with people. And again, we would encourage them to use our email, send us their information, and then we can, in fact, you know, put them on the mailing list. Friday, as I mentioned, is going to be Harvard. It's going to have a conference, which is available online, and we have made available the website, you know, to that. And if you go to Harvard Radcliffe, I'm sure you can find the website, so you can join them virtually. And that's a great, you know, stepping stone to understand. And I understand they have some wonderful sessions available. Going to the Longfellow House, you know, learning out of the Longfellow House, be guided by Emily Levine.
The one and truly only.
The Museum of African American History, you know, Leon Wilson, Lamerchi, Michaela Shepard, you know. So there's a number.
History of Cambridge.
The history of Cambridge, yeah, and Cambridge Black Genealogical Project, you know, history project. They have a wealth of information. And a shout out to Paula Paris, who, you know, is a guiding force here in the coalition. And again, actually, you can sit down. You can sit down with Paula. You can probably.
She's done very good with our minutes. So thank you, Paula.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And if you sit down with her, you probably can skip going to a lot of institutions, because she is a walking history book herself. So thank you, Paula.
And again, if you guys are interested in getting our monthly newsletter, please send an email to Slave Legacy History Coalition @yahoo.com, and we can get you on that mailing list that comes out every single month. And we also send out a newsletter for our upcoming events.
Thank you both so much, and thanks to folks for this really lovely conversation in the chat as well. We're going to hand it back over to Karen, but I'd just like to say I think myself and all of the folks at the Longfellow House are deeply honored to continue learning about this history from you and your family and others. It is a deep and ongoing process, and something that we are again honored and proud to be able to work on in collaboration with you. So thank you so much, and looking forward to continuing these conversations with all of you here on the call this evening. And now I'll hand it back over to Karen.
I'm just blown away. Thank you so much. I know I made a joke being like, every presentation is my favorite presentation. Not a joke. This was absolutely stunning and amazing. Thank you so much for coming. And also thank you to all of you for joining. And I want to thank the Longfellow House and also National Parks Program, National Park Services, and Sean and everyone for just having this season of National Parks Presentation Presents to be probably our most epic one to date. I really, truly appreciate it. And also genealogy stuff you can look up at the Boston Public Library. Don't forget us.
Absolutely, Boston Public Library.
Sorry, we forgot.
No, it's all good. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
God bless you.
everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.